All right, great, great. So let's start first with any questions that you do have related to Module 3, assigned activities that are going to be due to tonight. So if you have any questions, any topics that you want to review related to Module 3 assigned activities, like the blood, respiration, and immunity, so please let me know if you do have any questions here related to those topics. No questions? No? How about the rest of you? All right, so any questions related to the digestive system? This is the main chapters that we're focusing on this week. Any question related to the digestive system? All right, so uh, your upcoming lab exam, the lab exam 4, it's a big exam like the cardiovascular system. It's gonna be out of 100 points. We do have lots of materials that is covered in this exam. This includes the digestive system and the reproductive system. So we have many diagrams which are important in both of those two chapters that you're going to have on the test. Also, we're going to have a big essay question related to the reproduction that we're going to discuss in the next weeks. So let's start here with a quick overview of the important diagrams. We're going to be rating the diagrams the same way like we do for the diagrams which are important for us for the lab exam. So we'll start first with this diagram. It's a 5 stars diagram, highly important diagram that shows the gastrointestinal tract and the associated organs to the tract that form the digestive system. So starting first with the tract, we start with the oral cavity, and the food is going to be traveling from the oral cavity backwards to the part of the pharynx located posterior to the oral cavity. This is my oropharynx, and then travels down to the part of the pharynx located posterior to the larynx. This is my laryngopharynx, and then will travel through a muscular tube that passes through the chest, passing the diaphragm to be connected to the stomach. This is my esophagus. The food will then be conducted to this sac. This is my stomach, where it gets partially digested, and then will travel from the stomach to the small intestine. And we have 3 parts of the small intestine. The most proximal portion of the small intestine, this C-shaped part, it's my duodenum. Distal to the duodenum, we have the jejunum, and the most distal segment of the small intestine, it's the ileum. In the small intestine, you're going to be completing the digestion, allowing the absorption of the nutrients to be passing to your blood. The remaining part of the foods that failed to get digested and absorbed will be traveling to the large intestine from the ileum to this pouch-like structure of the large intestine. We call this is the cecum. Once the feces accumulate in the cecum, this will cause the distension of the cecum, creating a high pressure. So the feces now gonna be traveling up into this portion of the colon. Is gonna be the ascending colon. The ascending colon flexes and travels horizontally. We're gonna call this is my transverse colon. And then it flexes one more time and travels downwards, forming the descending colon. And then I have this S-shaped part of the colon. We call this is a sigmoid colon. Sigmoid colon will conduct the feces to the rectum, straight part of the large intestine are here. That will then, when distended, will be contracting, squeezing those feces to the outside of the body, passing through the anal canal, and the opening of the anal canal is the anus. So the gastrointestinal tract, digestive tract, again is formed of the oral cavity, pharynx, esophagus, stomach, small, large intestine. Associated with the digestive tract, you've got multiple glands. This includes the salivary glands. You've got one in here that is located covering the angle of the mandible and the muscles around it. We call this the parotid gland. We've got a salivary gland that is located below the tongue. We're going to call this is my sublingual gland. And we've got another salivary gland that is located below the floor of the oral cavity. We call this is my submandibular gland. Another gland that is associated with the gastrointestinal tract to form the digestive system is going to be the liver. And the liver plays an important role in the digestion by producing the bile, which gets stored and concentrated within this muscular sac located on the ventral surface of the liver. We call this is my gallbladder. Once it senses the passage of the food into your stomach and small intestines, the gallbladder will be contracting, squeezing the bile to meet with the food in the duodenum. This is again a highly important diagram. It's a 5 stars diagram. 5 stars diagram. Another less important diagram is this diagram showing a transverse section of the abdominal cavity, and inside of it we've got the peritoneal cavity. The peritoneum, like any serous membrane, is formed of 2 layers: a visceral layer that covers the outer surface of the organs, and an outside layer that will be lining the inside of the body cavity. This is the same like what we've seen with the pleura, what we've seen with the pericardium. But the major difference here between the peritoneum and the pleura and pericardium is that the peritoneum is not surrounding just one organ inside the cavity, but instead it surrounds multiple organs. So you're going to have connections that get created by the visceral layer, like the connection here between the organ and the posterior wall of the peritoneal cavity. We call this the dorsal mesentery. And the connections that will get created between the various abdominal organs, and between the abdominal organs and the ventral wall of the cavity. We call this is my ventral mesentery. Those mesenteries will allow you to keep the abdominal organ placed in the peritoneal cavity with minimal movements. This is again a three stars diagram. Three stars diagram. A five stars diagram that we're looking at in here is the general structure of the gastrointestinal tract. Pharynx, esophagus, stomach, small and large intestines, they have those common features in their structure. What are the different layers of the wall of the gastrointestinal tract? Generally speaking, we've got the innermost layer of the gastrointestinal tract is going to be the mucosa. Mucosa. The mucosa has an epithelial lining, and underneath the epithelium, we've got a layer of areolar connective tissue. Remember, any epithelium needs to be supported by connective tissue in order for it to get its nutrients and oxygen. So the layer of connective tissue that is located underneath the epithelium of the mucosa, this is what we call the lamina propria. Lamina propria. To the outside or to the outside of the lamina propria, I have a thin layer of smooth muscles in the mucosa. So I have muscles of the mucosa. So we're gonna call this muscle layer of the mucosa. It's the muscularis mucosa. Muscularis mucosa is again the muscle layer of the mucosa, which is the innermost layer of the gastrointestinal tube. To the outside of the mucosa, we're going to have a layer of connective tissue located underneath my mucosa. So we're going to call this layer is my submucosa. Sub below, so the layer of connective tissue here located below the mucosa, we call it submucosa. And the submucosa is where the blood vessels, the lymphatic vessels, and glands gonna be located. To the outside of the submucosa, we're gonna have muscle layers in the wall of the gastrointestinal tube. We're gonna call those muscle layers the musculosa or the muscularis externa. The most common organization of the muscularis externa is that it's going to be formed by an inner circular muscle layer and an outer longitudinal muscle layer. This is the common organization of the musculosa. We do have different exceptions, various exceptions in the gastrointestinal tract, in which I might have three layers, like in the stomach, rather than two layers. Might have different arrangement in the wall. So I would have inner longitudinal and outer circular, like in the pharynx. But the common organization of the musculosa in your gastrointestinal tract is going to be having circular muscle layer on the inside and longitudinal muscle layer on the outside. To the outside of the musculosa or the muscularis externa, we're going to have a thin layer that covers the whole tube from outside. We're going to call this is my serosa. Serosa. The serosa has a very delicate layer of connective tissue, and it's covered with one row of flat cells, simple squamous epithelium to the outside. So again, what are the four main layers that share in the formation of the gastrointestinal tube? We've got mucosa on the inside. Underneath it, we have the submucosa. Underneath the submucosa, we've got the musculosa or the muscularis externa, and the outermost layer of the gastrointestinal tube, it's going to be the serosa. Again, this is a highly important diagram. It's a 5 stars diagram. Looking here at another important diagram showing a sagittal section of the oral cavity, you're going to be familiar with all the markings on this diagram because this was actually part of a previous diagrams that we've studied in the respiratory system that shows the upper respiratory tract. So if we're looking first at the oral cavity, you're going to see that the roof is formed by the hard palate, soft palate, and pending down in the midline from the soft palate, it's going to be the uvula. The floor of the oral cavity is going to be formed by the tongue as you see on here and the other muscles that share in the formation of the floor of the mouth. We're going to see on both sides at the inlet of the oropharynx, 2 tonsils, which are my palatine tonsils. We do have other tonsils, like the one that you can see on here, located in the tongue. So we're going to call it the tongue tonsil, or the tonsil of the tongue here, something related to the tongue. It's lingual or glossal. So glossal means related to the tongue. Lingual also means related to the tongue. So we've got the tonsil of the tongue in here. We're going to call it the lingual tonsil. The food will then be traveling to the part of the pharynx posterior, located posterior to the oral cavity. We call this is again my oropharynx. This muscular tube will keep the food moving downwards to reach the part of the pharynx located posterior to my voice box. This is going to be my laryngopharynx. And anterior to the laryngopharynx, as you see on here, the different cartilages that will share in the formation of the larynx. The first one, which was formed by elastic cartilage that kinks down to prevent the passage of fluids and food into your airways. This is the epiglottis. We have a large muscle on here that shares in building up the skeleton of the voice box. This is my thyroid cartilage. And another one in here, this is my cricoid cartilage. Downwards from the laryngopharynx, you're going to be traveling down through a muscular tube that is located behind the larynx and the trachea. This is going to be my esophagus. So the esophagus will be carrying the food, fluids from the pharynx down to the stomach. Another important diagram is showing here an anterior view of the oral cavity. So what can we see on here? We see the roof of the oral cavity formed anterior by the hard palate. The anterior 2/3 of the palate, it's going to be the hard palate because it has the palatine plates of the maxillary bone and the palatine bones underneath the mucosal line. And we're going to have posterior to the hard palate, this posterior 1/3 of the palate, it's the soft palate, where I've got muscles forming it. Bending down from the midline here of the soft palate, if you notice, bending down, it's going to be the uvula. And the uvula is important because it will be contracting to close the nasopharynx while you are swallowing to prevent any food or liquids from traveling up into your nasal cavity. We also can see here two arches. One is connecting the palate to the tongue, so we're going to call this is my palatoglossal arch, and one that connects the palate to the pharynx, located posterior to it, is going to be my palatopharyngeal arch. Between the two arches, we can see here those tonsils on both sides. Those are my palatine tonsils that we've seen in the previous diagram on here. Those again are my palatine tonsils. We see this ridge that travels the midline of the hard palate. We call this is my palatine raphe. We can also notice that the lips are attached to the mucosal covering of the maxilla and the mandible. So the upper lip is attached to the mucosal covering of the maxillary bone by the superior labial frenulum, and the lower lip here is going to be attached to the mucosal covering of the mandible by the inferior labial frenulum. Also, we can see on here the attachment between the tongue and the floor of the oral cavity. So this is a frenulum that attaches the tongue. So we're going to call this is my lingual frenulum. Again, something related to the tongue is called lingual. We can notice on here, on both sides of the lingual frenulum, we've got the openings of the ducts of the submandibular glands, those two large ones on both sides, and we have many smaller ones that are located laterally on both sides of the lingual frenulum, and those are the openings of the ducts of the sublingual salivary glands. So again, important markings on here. The upper lip is connected to the mucosal covering of the maxilla by the superior labial frenulum. Lower lip is attached to the mucosal covering of the mandible by the inferior labial frenulum. We can here add the palate, hard palate. Posteriorly is going to be my soft palate. The pending portion on here in the midline, it's going to be the youth. This ridge that travels at the midline of the hard palate, this is my palatine raphe. And we've got two arches that will get formed between the arch and tongue. This is going to be the palatoglossal arch. Between the palate and the tongue is the palatoglossal arch, and between the palate and the pharynx is going to be my palatopharyngeal arch. Between the two arches again, we've got the tonsils. We call those are my palatine tonsils. Looking at a less important diagram, what we need to be able to identify on this diagram is just the different types of papillae located on the dorsal surface of the tongue. The most common type of papillae, those are the filiform papillae scattered covering most of the dorsal surface of the tongue. They are mainly responsible for increasing the friction between the tongue and the food, which will help with chewing, mixing of the food. Another type of papillae, those are the scattered reddish dots between the filiform papillae. We're going to call those are my fungiform papillae. fungiform papilla, arranged in a row, V-shaped row in the posterior part of the tongue. Those are going to be my circumvallate papillae, and located laterally in the posterior 1/3 of the lateral aspects of the tongue, we've got the foliate papillae. Fungiform papillae, circumvallate papillae, and foliate papillae all will act as taste buds. The only one which is not taste bud in here is going to be the filiform papilla, and again, it's going to be mainly responsible for increasing the roughness of the surface of the tongue. And this will allow you to mix the food with the saliva while chewing. Again, this is a 3 stars diagram. It's much less important compared to the previous one because it simply contains less information that are required from you to know. So again, we need only to know the types of those 4 papillae. We need to be able to identify them on the tongue. Another less important diagram is going to be a 3 stars diagram showing the salivary glands and the related organs that they are positioned next to. All right, so the 3 types of salivary glands. The first one, it's going to be located, as you see, covering the angle of the mandible. This is going to be the parotid gland with its duct conducting its salivary secretions to the oral cavity. We have below the tongue the sublingual salivary gland, and below the floor of the oral cavities is going to be my submandibular gland. The only things that you need to worry about in this diagram is going to be able to identify the different salivary glands and their ducts. So the only thing that is important here on this diagram for you to be able to identify the 3 different types of salivary glands in their ducts. Any question? Any question? Questions? Okay, so moving on to another diagram. This is a diagram that will be showing the structure of the stomach. It's a highly important diagram. It's a must be on your test. This is a diagram that must be on your test. Looking here, the esophagus carries the food down to the stomach. The region of the stomach where it gets connected to the esophagus, this is what we call the cardia or the cardiac region. Stomach has a dome-shaped portion. This is what we call the fundus. Then I have the middle region on here, all this part, this is my body of the stomach. Then I have a terminal funnel-shaped segment. We call this the pylorus. And the pylorus has an entrance. We call this the pyloric antrum. We have a tunnel through which the food is going to be traveling. We call this the pyloric canal. And in order for me to regulate the passage of the food from the stomach to the small intestine to prevent large amounts of food from traveling all of a sudden to the small intestine, the outlet of the stomach is going to be guarded by sphincter. So we're going to call this sphincter on here, located in the pylorus. This is my pyloric sphincter. So again, what are we looking at in here? We're looking at the cardia, fundus, body of the stomach, the pylorus, pyloric antrum, pyloric canal, and pyloric sphincter. Those ridges on the inside of the gastric mucosa, those are called the rugae, like the ones that we've seen before in the urinary bladder, if you remember. Also, something to notice on this diagram is the number of muscle layers that we have in the wall of the stomach. Stomach doesn't have just two muscle layers, like most of the rest of the gastrointestinal tract. It has an extra layer of smooth muscles. So 3 layers of smooth muscles on here are going to be located in the musculosa or the muscularis externa. So we're going to see on here, it has an outer longitudinal layer, a middle circular layer, and an inner oblique layer. And why is it so important to have 3 layers of muscles rather than 2 in the stomach? Because the stomach is not just a tube. It had a third dimension that it needs to allow the movement of the food within, because it's a sac rather than just a tube. And this explains why I would have 3 muscle layers in the wall of the stomach rather than just 2 muscle layers. A less important diagram is the diagram showing the histological picture of the wall of the stomach. You're going to see the 4 main layers, like all the different parts of the gastrointestinal tract: mucosa, submucosa, musculosa, and serosa. But major differences on here that we can see is the presence of those crypts, the invaginations of the epithelium to the inside of the mucosa. Those are my mucosal crypts that we haven't seen back when we checked the different layers of the gastrointestinal tract. Another key difference on here is the presence of 3 muscle layers in the musculosa. So we've got an oblique layer, circular layer, and longitudinal layer. So you've got this extra oblique layer that you didn't have in most of the gastrointestinal tract. Again, this is a 3 stars diagram. 3 stars diagram. Moving on to another less important diagram is going to be the diagram showing the structure of the wall of the small intestine. So I will still have the same layers: mucosa, serosa, mucosa, submucosa, musculosa, and serosa. But some things that I can notice on here in the small intestine is that the small intestine, unlike the stomach, it had only crypts. But here I have finger-like projections of the mucosa of the small intestine. We call those are the villi. And this gonna be playing a really important role in increasing the surface area for the absorption in the small intestine. Please make sure that you are able to differentiate what are the villi compared to the microvilli. Villi, those are finger-like projections of the epithelium of the mucosa. So we have many cells in the villus. But the microvilli are the finger-like projections coming out from the cytoplasmic membrane of each cell. So again, a villus is the finger-like projection of the mucosa. The microvilli are the finger-like projections coming out from the plasma membrane of the individual cells. Does this make sense? Does this make sense here? All right, so moving on to a highly important diagram, a must be on your test type of diagrams. This is going to be the diagram showing the relationship between liver, pancreas, and the duodenum, which is the proximal part of my small intestine. So you can see the liver. The liver, as you see, it has 4 lobes that I can only see 2 of them on this diagram. 4 lobes are my right lobe, left lobe, and I have 2 that I can see from the ventral surface of the liver. Those are the caudate and the quadrate lobes. The hepatocytes of the liver are going to be releasing the bile through tiny capillaries that will drain the bile into 2 main ducts on here, one coming from the right hepatic lobe and one is coming from the left hepatic lobe. We call those ducts are my right and left hepatic ducts. The right and left hepatic ducts are going to fuse and will drain the bile into the common hepatic duct. The common hepatic duct is going to be connected downwards with the bile duct, which has a sphincter. So if I'm not receiving food into my small intestine, into the stomach, this sphincter is going to be closed. So the only other pathway for the bile coming down from the liver is to move into the gallbladder, traveling through its duct. We call this is my cystic duct. Cystic duct. So what happens if I have food coming down from the stomach into the duodenum? So now it's time for me to release the concentrated bile from my gallbladder. So the gallbladder is a muscular sac located on the ventral surface of the liver. Its main function is going to be to concentrate and release whenever necessary the concentrated bile. The bile coming out from the gallbladder will travel through the cystic duct, and then from the cystic duct it travels into the bile duct, and the bile duct is going to be connected with the duct coming from the pancreas. This is my main pancreatic duct. So those 2 ducts together will form this bulging duct. This is my hepatopancreatic ampulla that is surrounded by a sphincter to regulate the passage of the hepatic and pancreatic secretions into the duodenum. On the inside of the small intestine, we can see the opening of the hepatopancreatic duct in here is surrounded by a lip. Because this is my major duodenal pupil. You can also see that the pancreas has a portion of it surrounded by this C-shaped part of the small intestine, the duodenum. because this is the head of the pancreas. Then I have a middle portion of the pancreas on here. This is the body of the pancreas. And the terminal end of the pancreas, it's going to be the tail of the pancreas. So again, the pathway of the bile starts from gallbladder, cystic duct, bile duct, hepatopancreatic ampulla, then travels into the duodenum, passing through the major duodenal papilla. Another highly important diagram is a diagram showing the different parts of the large intestine. Remember, the large intestine receives the undigested and absorbed part of the food through the terminal part of the small intestine, which is my ileum. So the feces on here are going to be traveling from the ileum into this pouch-like portion of the large intestine. This is the cecum. Connected to the cecum is the vermiform appendix. Also, I will have a valve that allows the unidirectional movement of the feces. So you don't want to have feces traveling back from the cecum into your small intestine. So you're going to need to have a unidirectional movement of the feces on here from the ileum to the cecum. So we have a valve on here, we call it the ileocecal valve. Once the cecum is filled with feces, this will increase the tension on the wall of the cecum, causing it to push the feces upwards in the part of the colon that we call the ascending colon. Why did we call it ascending colon? Because simply the feces inside are going to be traveling up. And then the colon flexes and travels horizontally. We call this flexure on the right side. This is my right colic flexure, or we're going to call it the hepatic flexure because it's on the same side as the liver. So the liver is located on the right side, your abdominal cavity. The transverse colon gonna flex on us one more time on the left side and will travel down. We're gonna call this flexure is the left colic flexure, or we're gonna call it the splenic flexure. The colon gonna be traveling down, carrying the feces downwards. And this is gonna be called the descending colon. Descending colon will allow the feces to travel next into this S-shaped portion of the colon. We're going to call this is my sigmoid colon. Something to remember about the sigmoid colon, this is the most common site for development of constipation because it's not like a direct path that the feces are going to be traveling through. They need to travel down, up, down one more time. So there is a lot of movement in different directions. This would slow down the movement of the feces, and this carries the risk of developing constipation. As the stools remain for a longer time in the colon will be absorbing more and more water out of the stools, making the stools harder to release, or what we call the fecal stools. Sigmoid colon will conduct the feces down to this straight part of the large intestine. This is the rectum. And the rectum allows the feces to travel to the outside of the body, passing through the anal canal, which is guarded by two sphincters, one on the inside, one on the outside. We can only see the one on the outside in here. So one inside is my internal anal sphincter, and one on the outside is going to be part of the pelvic floor. This is the external anal sphincter. And the stools will finally travel to the outside of the opening of the anal canal or the anus. So you need only to know the ones that have been highlighted on this diagram. So please take a screenshot of this diagram. It's very unlikely to be tested on the superior mesenteric artery on this diagram. It's not that clear. Less likely to be tested on the transverse mesocolon, epiploic appendages, and the tinea coli. So those four markings are much less likely to appear on your test and not important for us in terms of lab exam. All right, so again, what we need to be able to identify, of course, ileum, cecum, ileocecal valve, vermiform appendix, ascending colon, right colic flexure or hepatic flexure, transverse colon, left colic flexure or splenic flexure, descending colon, sigmoid, rectum, anal canal, anus, external anal sphincter. All right. So again, how many diagrams do we have related to the digestive system which are important for you to prepare? Again, this is the first one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. So we've got 12 diagrams that you need to prepare for the upcoming lab exams, the lab exam 4 from the digestive system. All right. Any questions? Any questions? All right, so for today's in-class activity, please answer this and name the different markings on this diagram. So those are the ones that we've just discussed together, so I won't be going over them with you right now. Please take a screenshot and get them completed. If you can't recall any of the information, this is the same exact diagram that you have on your PowerPoint presentation, so please check them out if you can't remember any of them. Questions? So you do it, yeah, so you're gonna do it like as a homework that you're gonna be writing down the answer of for today's in-class activity session. All right, so any questions, concerns, comments that you want to address to me before we end the meeting? Next meeting, we're going to discuss a little about the metabolism handout. It's a self-explanatory assignment. So there is not much that I will be actually explaining for the assignment. It has all the